My name is Jonathan Norman from the Major Projects Knowledge Hub, and I'm delighted to be able to interview Sarah Fox, a lawyer with 25 years experience in construction projects. Sarah, welcome. Let's start with the name of your company, 500 Words. Do you want to explain where this comes from and what is its significance?
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I've been training people on construction contracts. So I was a lawyer for 25 years, as you've said. I also got involved in training lawyers on construction contracts and training clients on construction contracts. And it very quickly became apparent that nobody read them all the way through to the end. I put quite a lot of the standard forms that we use in UK construction through a Word account. And we were looking at sort of up to 50,000 words before they'd been amended and before we thought about any of the legal annexes and the works documents. And that's pretty much the length of some of the Shakespeare plays and some of the early J.K. Rowling novels. And I kind of thought, well, I can't provide someone that as part of a training tool because they haven't got the time to read it and grasp it and understand it. So I decided to try and kind of play devil's advocate myself and see how low I could go in terms of what you actually need to create a contract. And it's only then when I started to strip out what was necessary to create a workable contract and what was nice to have process, filling around the edges, that then I tried to develop that into just 500 words. 500 words is essentially a side of A4. So it's very easy to grasp what it says quickly. There's, various alarm bells go off as to what's missing. But at the same time, it became quite a useful tool. And then some of them said, actually, we quite like this. We quite like the structure. We quite like the simplicity. We've got lots of projects we could use this on. Can we use it? And like most lawyers, I went, oh no, I haven't got a clue how that might work. How that might work for me. My liabilities, your interest, and all that kind of stuff. So it went a bit on the back burner, but I've become increasingly interested because I used to work for a large commercial law firm, and they had major clients who were banks, repeat clients, dealing major projects. 500 Words was never designed for them. But at the same time, I was conscious that there's 1 million companies in the construction industry, or SMEs or micro enterprises, who essentially currently work on the back of a specification and price fag packet style contract at the moment. Or they might, with a few word processing skills, have managed to cobble something together off the millions of pages on the internet, created a contract based on someone else's terms and conditions. But both of those aspects, the idea of either doing it on a wing and a prayer or doing it on the back of somebody else's rubbish contract, I didn't think was necessarily good for them. So if I could provide SMEs in particular with a tool that would help them do business better,
Yes,
but at least cover the very core essentials that you would expect to see in a contract in a clear, simple way that means they don't have to get a lawyer involved to read it, to understand it, to negotiate it. It's designed for users rather than for lawyers. Then that was actually a positive tool. So I ended up writing books, and also because I ended up in conversations with people saying that you couldn't, or one couldn't write a contract in 500 words, and I would reply and go, yeah, well, yes, you can. It's not a holy grail. It's not, a paradigm contract, which I think everyone should follow. But it was getting people back to the idea that actually, even on major projects, if you said to them, right, we're going to do a major project, let's start with a blank piece of paper, you would really struggle, even after months of hard effort, to get to 100,000 words to define that project. But
yes.
because word processing has made it extremely easy to copy and paste and pull large documents together very quickly, then that's what we do. Construction sector is an inherently risky sector because every single project is a unique blend of design, parties, place, economic circumstances, and everything else. So even with modular construction, we're not talking off-the-shelf projects from start to finish. We're not buying sheds and putting them on top of gardens. That's not what construction's about. Fundamentally, what we do is risky. And using a contract to tie down all the uncertainty just means that we're stifling innovation, we're preventing collaboration, we're making it adversarial because we're passing risk. We're not allowing people to communicate openly, fairly, honestly. We're not recognizing that everyone in that process has to make a profit. And that setting a price on day one and sticking rigidly to it will mean that somewhere someone along the line is going to lose out, and that's going to result in tensions. And if you've got a long major project, you've got 36 weeks on site or whatever, you can't afford to have people fall out on day one and then continue and try and get along. We know from the Wembley Stadium project that Multiplex and its major steel contractor fell out. The steel subcontract was worth 60 million quid, and they fell out in virtually the first couple of weeks, and they spent years on that site, and it got bitterly divisive. It didn't help the project, it didn't help either of the parties. Lots of litigation. Everyone was a loser. Every single person on that project became a loser. Wembley Stadium didn't lose because it's a beautiful project. So the project as a project doesn't lose, but the parties involved, lost an awful lot of money, lost reputation, suffered quite a lot. So I'm not sure that more paperwork helped them, because it tied them into processes which didn't necessarily suit the new circumstances they found their way in. So, that contract had to last 7 years. Well, the idea that a contract should be kind of rigid for 7 years, explaining all the processes and how you're going to work together during, massive technological change, seems bonkers.
Yes.
In the same way that if somebody said, I'm going to tie you into a smartphone contract for the next 20 years, you'd look at them as if they were mad, because 20 years ago, the type of phones we have and the type of phones we have now are poles apart. The same is true in the construction industry. The technology is changing rapidly, but the contracts aren't allowing that change because they're kind of fixed in stone. I think what has happened is the contract is considered to be a sort of hurdle to get over, a tick box exercise. Like say writing a health and safety policy or well-being policy. We've done it. We've now ticked that box that says contract or well-being policy or health and safety policy done. But until you actually do something with that, it's just another piece of paper stuck in a drawer somewhere, gathering dust, or on a shelf. It's not actually part of the contracting process. So contracting should start when the idea for the project goes from being, a twinkle in somebody's eye to a piece of paper of some sort, a sketch, a design, a feasibility stage. So contracting should cover the whole process from that idea to the end of the construction phase. It probably doesn't go into occupation use phases and asset life cycle, but it certainly covers the whole project life cycle. But yet it's kind of been carved out and delegated as a sort of just a nice to have at this point. And we know that we're not very good in construction at even doing that at the right point of time, because the data shows about 2/3 of projects only start with a contract being in place. Well, that means there's about £3 billion worth of work done in the UK without a contract.
Yes.
But that means contracting, the contract is no longer considered an essential part of the contracting process. It's become a sort of sideshow, not part of the whole relationship building, relationship carrying on, communication, risk management, all the stuff that we know does happen on site. The contract doesn't talk to it at all.
Yes.
It's kind of like we've written it in a foreign language and we've just kind of put it in a silo and gone, tick, we've done it. And because it's so legal and so it doesn't talk to the other parts, the drawings, the process, the costings and everything else, it kind of just sits there on the shelf. I've got maybe a devil on the shoulder rather than a useful, tool.
Yes.
And fundamentally, I think a contract should be a tool to help you do the project. So it should be a benefit throughout the contracting cycle, throughout the project life cycle, and hopefully a benefit to the asset life cycle as well if it's done well enough.
Yes.
But reality is, it's just a tick box. It's boring. It's paperwork. It's a burden to business. It's a barrier to building good relationships.
Yes.
Not actually doing what we'd like it to do. At the moment, we effectively have a hierarchy and a cascade of supply chain. So that's why they refer to a supply chain, because we have a chain of contracts going from funder down to sub contractor. And that chain has to be complete and it has to pass on liability. And generally speaking, the further you are down the chain, the lower the tier you have, the more documents you have to read, because you have to comply with all the hierarchical contracts. That seems to me bonkers, that the person at the very bottom of the supply chain actually has more paper that controls what they do than the person at the top who's earning the most profit, taking the most risk, and has the most resources to do all of that. So that doesn't, bilateral contracts, so two-party contracts result in more adversarial behaviours because they relate to bilateral insurance arrangements where effectively you're not insured unless you've got someone to blame. So that is very much our current culture in the UK construction industry for the majority of processes. Collaborative relational contracting should produce multi-party contracts where you have a much shorter chain of contracts or a network of contracts. They would fit much better with building information modelling, collaborative working, better cost scenarios. So rather than looking at lump sum passing cost risk out to the supply network, you're actually working on a fair and equitable basis. As long as you can establish that those costs are related to the project, directly incurred as a result of the project and not your own incompetence effectively, then you get paid for it. Clients struggle with that idea because they like the apparent certainty of lump sum design and build risk transfer. But I think if we looked at full data on outturn costs and everything else, we'd find that they're not as certain as clients believe them to be from the beginning. So I think behavioural, we'd look, contracts would set behavioural standards, they'd set processes that were collaboratively developed rather than imposed by, say, a publisher of a standard form or imposed from the funder down. So everyone in the supply network would have an input into what that looked like to suit the project as a whole. So the project would kind of be the core of the focus rather than individual parties trying to get a bigger piece of the pie.
Yes.
So, you know, effectively, so I remember a Ladybird story about the magic porridge pot, which as long as you said the right words, more porridge would appear. And I think that's almost like the concept that at the moment we have a single bowl of porridge, and now everyone's trying to get their spoon in as fast as possible to get their amount of porridge out first. But actually we could just have not a magic porridge pot that just goes on forever, but actually a porridge pot that reflects that actually the amount of porridge just might not be enough. So all the processes, the money, the risk transfer and everything else is dealt with on a very different basis to the way we deal with it now.
Yes.
Hopefully nobody gets paid in porridge. I think at the moment we've got a bit of a shiny new thing in the corner, distracting us from the current problems that we have with contracts. So digital contracts won't solve our contracting problems until we solve the information going into that digital model for contracting. So if we digitize our current 50,000 word JCT contracts, for example, we just got a digital disaster, it seems to me, because it's very hard to digitize very long contracts. So that we first of all need to recognise that a paper-based, wet-signed, set-in-stone contract is not actually very good. It's not good at dealing with uncertainty. It's not good at dealing with innovation or process. It becomes set in stone. So for major projects, it can't possibly be a living, breathing, collaborative document. So the first thing is to recognise how poor we are currently, and that although we have contracts, they're not used to their full potential in the industry. They're kind of like the bad guys. The second thing is to recognise that we can turn those into PDFs, but that doesn't make them a digital contract. That just makes them a different version of the existing paper-based contract. So we can sign them electronically, but digital contracts kind of require us to be able to build them from a digital platform. So that means answering a series of questions. It could be about the procurement style, it could be about who's writing the contract, so whether it's a main contract, a subcontract or whatever. It will automatically bring in digital information that we already have, so the building information modelling information, the execution plan, the all that kind of stuff, the cost profile, the programs, all the drawings, the specification, all of which are now being done digitally. It can talk to change management systems, task systems, all that kind of stuff. So actually we have one place where we're storing the whole digital contract, both as it was when it was originally signed and as it has progressed during the course of the project. So that's really useful for paper trails and audit trails, but it's also useful because it allows us to recognise that it was just a starter for 10 what we signed. It wasn't what's going to happen. It's not future looking. This is where we think we are, But as long as we've got good, clear processes that allow us to manage the uncertainties that inevitably will arise on this project, then we've got a control over where it's going to go, and we've got options. A digital contract should be done by effectively a contract bank, a clause bank, which has various different processes as part of it, and a decision tree based logic system where you answer a series of questions, and if you answer that you want a lump sum contract, or you want a remeasurement contract, or you want a target cost contract, then it populates appropriate clauses. So that rather than having, at the moment, we've got sort of 150 standard form contracts in construction from about 10 different publishers, we could do with a couple of decent decision trees and a bank of clauses that are consistent, so that we don't have to worry about arguing about entire agreement clauses, the kind of legal nitty-gritty that gets an amount of attention which is wholly disproportionate to the interests of any of the parties to it in terms of commercial, operational, technical impact, and also whether or not it actually causes any disputes or helps any disputes. Yeah. So, by doing a digital process, we also will need to move towards more deliverable based contracts. At the moment, a lot of the wording that we have in contracts is very subjective. We talk about things like reasonable skill and care, to the satisfaction of somebody, in the opinion of X, a reasonable time, a fair estimate. All of those things are very difficult to code and very difficult then to turn into a smart contract. So a smart contract is the next evolution. Now, at the moment, we're still based in the sort of mid-19th century paper-based wet sign contracts. Banking went out of that years ago, but we're still very much there. Some people are moving towards PDF-based electronically signed. So that cuts the process slightly, but since we're still using the same content, it's not actually changing the content of those relationships, the collaborative nature and everything else. We can move to digital contracts, which are easier to update, quicker to update, more transparent, more live, more collaborative. And smart contracts would mean that certain processes in the construction industry could be automated. So, for example, once a particular delivery was made to site, particularly of large pieces of plant or kit or cranes, then provided the site manager had ticked the right box in the in the database, then an automated payment would be sent out. Human activity is still going to be important, but once a particular logic gate had been flipped, then things would automate. So payment could be automated. Even certificates of completion and making good defects could become automated. It could make it much easier to update programs. It could make lots of things easier. It won't automate the whole of the carrying out of the contract, because obviously a lot of the carrying out of the contract is performing the works, carrying out the goods, works and services. So that can't be automated, but there are processes within the contract that could certainly be improved. And it's a really important piece for construction, because we know that the Arcada's Global Dispute Survey say the number one global cause of construction disputes is poor contract administration. So that is the human element, not of either doing the works or paying for the works. It's working out whether the works have been done and how much should be paid. So that's kind of another step back. But the contract administration isn't well done. It's partly hampered by the need or the feel that they need to be right rather than act reasonably. That partly because the contractor and the employer have diverging opinions and aren't collaborating on whether or not something is done. Therefore, they're trying to sit in the middle and make their own decision in a lot of noise. So smart contracts could certainly improve that part of the element of disputes that we have in the construction industry, but they're not going to replace the need to do projects. One of the things to ask is what's affecting their bottom line? What bits of this contract actually impact their bottom line? So what are the current processes in that contract aren't working for them as a business? And quite a lot of, we know from there's the IACCM, which is the Institute for Contract Management, and they've looked at what causes disputes in construction, and the answer is money. Money causes the most volume of disputes. We get the most expensive disputes out of defects in quality. So it kind of depends on their business, whether or not their payment issues are more problematic, and that will probably depend whether they're a contractor or subcontractor. or it could be that their quality issues are more important because they're an asset life cycle, an asset owner. So that actually working out what makes the most difference to that business, then also working out what their style of business is. Are they essentially adversarial? Well, in which case existing contracts probably suit them well enough. But if they want to become more collaborative, and also I think it's important to think about whether or not they're interested in empowering their staff to use these contracts to help them do projects. Because contracts basically have two different functions. One is to help the parties do the project, and the other one is effectively a legal enforcement tool, a stick to beat you with when things go wrong. And actually understanding whether they want the contract to help them do business, so to reduce the hurdles before the project starts and to be useful during it, or just to be a sort of safety net backstop when things go wrong, you take a very different approach to how contracts are drafted. The majority of the contracts that are drafted nowadays are drafted on the kind of legal backstop safety net. NEC started off more as a project management tool, but because the way it's amended and sometimes where it's used, actually it also is creeping towards the legal enforcement tool in some respects. So, just what matters to your business? Is it user friendly? Is it legal enforcement? Is it your bottom line that's hurting? Is it the processes are just gluing your whole business up because you've got too much paperwork? What would make the biggest difference to your bottom line if we could start from scratch? So rather than how would we play with the existing contracts, what really, really matters to you as the business? And then let's see how we can structure something which hits those objectives. There are lots of really big global companies out there who recognize that contracts, where they've ended up to in contracts isn't where they ever thought they'd end up. It's just been a slow, incremental sort of tightening, more and more clauses, cases, insurers getting involved, risk people getting involved, everyone who's risk averse talking, and then realizing that what they've ended up with is something that's just unmanageable.
Yes.
So a lot of them are kind of going, well, you know what, let's do this on a piece of A4 because it'll be quick, it'll be easy, we can get the project started. Let's keep talking to one another because we haven't really got the answers. We haven't got a Bible of answers anymore. Let's keep talking to each other and develop between us how we're going to resolve these things as they arise, because uncertainty is a given in construction. And we could say now we're definitely going to do this, but if you find Richard III under your car park or an unexploded bomb, or you end up with 57 beasts from the east because of climate emergency, who should really take the risk of those? Can't we just talk about it and sit down like adults